subject that we're going to talk about today is huge, and it's many things, and there are a gazillion ways into it and out of it and away from it. So I guess what I just want to say is, if I don't go on too long, hopefully there will be some room for questions at the end, which is really the most fun part. And please ask anything. As Angela said, it might, and a lot of us who I think do medicine, especially palliative care perhaps, the personal and the professional are necessarily on some level pretty well interwoven. So I welcome any questions from you guys. So don't hold back, please. So this is Asclepius. I like to start here because palliative care, end-of-life care has a kind of a contemporary heat to it right now. Of course, we haven't just invented this subject. People have been dying a long time. And people have been engaged in helping one another through illness and through suffering for a very long time. So on some level, palliative care is relatively new. It's also relatively ancient. And so I like to kind of ground us with long, old history. So Asclepius, you guys may know, was half man, half god, not a real person, as far as we know. He was a son of Apollo, and Coronis was his mortal mother. And the myth goes, the story goes, that Coronis was unfaithful to Apollo. Apollo threw her into a fire, but she was pregnant with their unborn son, Asclepius. And he couldn't bear to kill his son, so he plucked Asclepius from her womb and then banished him to the woods. He couldn't kill him, but he was ashamed of him and just let him fend for himself. So Asclepius, who goes on to become a god of the healing arts, the important thing is here, he learns those healing arts by tending to himself first. He's often portrayed with a limp or a bum leg, and also, of course, the psychic wounds of abandonment. And that was his education in so many ways. And that's how he honed his craft. So he got so good at his craft, apparently, that he either brought someone back from the dead or was just about to. And Zeus got wind of this and threw a thunderbolt through him, because this was a no-no. The one thing that separated us humans from the gods was this mortality thing. We are mortal, they are not. And so he was blurring a line and was punished severely for it. You can read into that whatever you like, but the bigger point, I think, with Asclepius is that this idea gives us this template for a wounded healer. And my wounds are obvious, but I would venture to say that all of us in this room have some wound somewhere. It's just impossible to live more than a day or two in this planet and not find one. So let that be a point of common among us, and it's a really brilliant place to operate from if you're in the business of empathy. So that's Asclepius. Oh, one other thing to mention is the rod of Asclepius. I don't know if you use this symbol here. In the States, it's the symbol of the American Medical Association, which a few years ago, they had to disambiguate. There's the caduceus. You guys may have seen that, the staff with two serpents. Don't use that one. Use this one. The two serpent ones, look this up. It's hilarious. That is a symbol that represents commerce and treachery. So that is really, and I mean, there's like truth, like people are accidentally honest sometimes, and then in the States you'll see the caduceus used to emblemize medicine, which we wish it weren't so, but it too often is. But this is the one I think they mean to use. Okay, so let's start. My comments are going to be just provocations, really. I don't mean to hand you guys any conclusions. This is all it's a work in progress for everybody. But I am here to just sort of perhaps provoke thought, and please feel free to disagree with me or read anything into it you like. So I'm going to hand you a bunch of opinions on some level. One opinion is this question is sorely lacking in healthcare. That we very often get into trouble with ourselves and patients because we do things just because we can. There's a new drug or there's a new gizmo, and well, we should use it because we've got it, and doing anything less feels like you're holding back from somebody. And when there's doubt, and there's so often doubt, we always seem to err on doing more. And on some level there's respect in that, but in a lot of ways this is how we lead each other down increasingly difficult pathways, and more importantly pathways that people do not want to be on, were their eyes wide open to the contingencies, to the fallout of that plan. So I'm here to suggest that we just begin to ask ourselves why. Why are we doing this? Why am I in this profession? Why do we do this work? I think a lot of good could flow from it. So why are we here? Why are we in a healthcare system? Now, again, I'm coming from an American healthcare system which has flaws on steroids in a lot of ways. So I don't mean to overly project, but I would imagine that in some ways, any healthcare system can sometimes fall short of its promise. And that's really difficult, but it's a truth we need to deal with. So why is our health system the way it is? Well, I think we need to go back here. This is a painting called Ether Day. This is a painting of a moment in 1846 when ether was harnessed to put someone to sleep for the first operation under anesthesia. Great, a wonderful development. Those of us who have surgery, we should all be very, very grateful for this. But it also is the beginning of, so mid-19th century, this is where technology, the technological revolution really spools up. The industrial revolution's in full swing. Medicine and science become entwined. That wasn't always the case. Medicine was very often much more of a mystical endeavor. But this begins, for the next 170 years, we get the scientific method leading the way. And the idea that we're going to innovate our way up and out of all sorts of trouble. And in so many ways, right, we have. You know, I'm before you, thanks to the graces of a healthcare system that operates in that way. My life was saved by people who were applying the scientific method with great rigor, and I'm very grateful for that. And I think the case I'd like to make about palliative care is that palliative care is coming along to insert itself in some ways as a corrective, because this way of this approach to care, while successful in a lot of ways, also causes a lot of trouble. And what Angela pointed to, Dr. Farmer's quote, is kind of emblemizes that we abandon people very often at the very wrong moment. And I'll explain that a little bit further. But this is the moment where I think this sort of kicks off. This is mid-19th century, and we're now kind of trying to reconcile the failings of that system. This system held that disease was the cause of suffering. If we can just root out disease, no one suffers, we live happily ever after. I don't think any one of us, or anyone back then, banked on the insistence of suffering and the insistence of death. And we are now trying to accommodate that reality, rather than to forsake it. So, okay, great. How are we going to do all that? Another question I love and we should spend a lot of time on. It's been interesting to be in this work at this time, because when I first started, when I was a trainee, I remember it was a mind-numbing experience being in the hospitals and having conversations. The implications of the conversations were that mortality was an option. That if you just ate enough kale or if you just took the right meds, if you tried hard enough, if you fought hard enough, that death was this thing that you didn't have to go through. So we had these mind-bending conversations about whether someone had to die or whether we die, which was just farcical. It just seemed absurd and really distressful, because if you have to ignore half of reality in your work, it's really hard. So I think we're now also moving beyond not whether we die, but how we die, and that's a much more interesting and fruitful place to work from. Okay, so here, no doubt, too, everyone in this room, clinicians, administrators, everyone that goes into this work happening, you know full well the amount of devotion and effort and diligence it takes. I just get chills every time I say that, because I think of all the students, I think of my own journey through health education. I mean, what an amazing journey, but also it's an intense and incredible sacrifice, too. There's no two ways about it. So how do we reconcile systems and health systems and places that have all this devotion and really in love baked in, with outcomes that often leave patients and families in the lurch? So how do we reconcile our failings with all this devotion in the mix, too? Well, for my money, it's a design flaw. So I already kind of mentioned, we have this system that's designed around the disease. And in so many ways, the person is incidental to the disease. And that keeps it orderly and tidy, and it allows us to have really thick boundaries in clinical work and move on to the next, and on to the next, and on to the next. And allows us to become experts in something that patients don't know. While we may be experts in the disease, of course, we're not experts in what it means to be that person. And there's a lot, so therefore we get to hide behind in this disease-centric model. But this, I think, is where the problem lies. If we can do all the battle we would like with diseases. We can do all the hard work we want. We can set our sights on disease and focus on eradication, etc. I'm okay with that as long as we remember that that's on behalf of the human being. It's that last little piece that I think a lot of us has gone wayward and has gone missing. You don't always have the feeling, at least again in my health system and in my country, that this enterprise is really working on your behalf. And that's to have that cut in confidence does damage. It's hard, both on both sides, as the provider as well as the patient. So maybe what we need to do is reorganize this system, reorient this system around people. I know this sounds kind of convenient, but I really think so much would flow from that. If we focus on the person, then we would want to know that person very well. We would want to share with that person. We would want to understand that person and their differences. We wouldn't be annoyed by their differences, their outlierness. We would be attracted to those differences. We would get to work with them. Right now, those things get in the way in a disease-centric model. All right, so much could flow from this reorientation. It'll also have a way of bringing in all the folks who are clinically relevant but aren't medically trained per se. You know, there's social work and chaplaincy and nurses, volunteers, massage therapists, you name it. So, philosophers, religion, so much goes into the enterprise of being a human, much more than goes into the enterprise of being sick. And then lastly, I would say, while we're on it, okay, a lot of them I would say is you might find yourself sort of going, oh, that sounds great, BJ, how the heck are we going to do that? And I'm sorry, I don't have all those answers. But I do think hopefully, I want us to all kind of raise our gaze a little bit and see what might become. And what might become, perhaps, yeah, we want to focus on patients. Of course we want to focus on people, the patient. But those of us who have been patients also know that feeling, even with the most well-intended teams, that sometimes you're just being, I like this phrase, like you're being cared at. Like you lie there and you don't move so that you can catch their care one way or another. And you just sort of, and it's beautiful. I mean, really, in so many ways. I mean, when I think about the doctors and nurses and techs who took care of me, I didn't even know we could go on for hours about the power of their work for me personally and my family. But there are times where, again, it really feels like a one-way street, where I think so much of the action is in the relationship and is in the exchange, just like in any other facet of life. So maybe what we're really craving is something of a relationship-centric system. And that, of course, is in peril with the 15-minute encounters and the hyper-segmented work, and you're passed on you don't get to have long-lasting relationships. That our patients suffer with that, and we clinicians suffer from that too. Can you guys read that? Yep. So, okay, so palliative care, I know you guys know it. I do. I know St. Vincent has a really robust palliative care program. Even if you were all palliative care colleagues, I'd still start here because I think it's really important to remind ourselves what this field is about and how different it is. So let me just shut up and let you guys read it. Okay. Well, that's pretty beautiful. I mean, who wouldn't want that? Really. Couple things to say about it. Why is this novel? Well, for one, is it novel? Couldn't you guys, whatever field you're in, wouldn't you imagine you could cross out palliative care and just put in health care? You might say that's my active fantasy in the U.S. is that the Department of Health and Human Services is going to draft a new mission statement and it's going to say this. Because I think this is why all of us do the work we do, one way or another. And I'd be interested to hear if anyone feels otherwise. So one is this shouldn't be so exotic. But again, I feel like palliative care is sort of a corrective, so it feels exotic now. But someday maybe palliative care as a specialty gets to go away. Maybe all of healthcare is doing this. So you don't need a specialist to come along and say, oh, be nice to your patient. Oh, listen to your patient. Oh, treat your patient's pain. So the other thing to say about it is quality of life, suffering. There's a big word. So I love asking this. Who has not suffered? Okay. By the way, I've asked that question now of, I don't know, a lot of people. And there's one guy who raised his hand. And he came up after the talk, and he was like all turned on himself. And he's like, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I ruined your shtick there. I would never. My parents gave me everything. And I can't. I have a house, and I can't." And I had to interrupt him. I said, "Sir, you're suffering right now, pal. You're suffering right now." The poor guy felt like he didn't have any rights to say he'd suffered. He was out of this club, right? And it's so interesting. Suffering is such an interesting phenomenon. You don't want it, but it can't always be avoided. And I shudder to think of my life, what silly thoughts I would be clogged with if I hadn't suffered in some way. It's also one of our most amazing teachers. I don't want that. That's not a code for all the sadists among us to go cause suffering. That's not the idea. But it is endemic to being a human being. And respect goes with that. And that's why I think it's really important to tease out unnecessary suffering, the invented stuff, from the just nature-made stuff. All right? And the thing I love about suffering, that's a silly phrase, but the thing I do love about suffering is that besides its conjoining force, is that it's totally subjective. And I think this is why our subject in our field is really an odd fit with a system that's hell-bent on objectivity. This is totally subjective. I do not get to say whether you're suffering. I don't have a test for that. You got to tell me. You, patient, need to tell me. And so right out of the chutes, this work has a way of rejiggering the balance between clinician and patient. It's not clinician holding exotic knowledge up here that the patient doesn't have, and hopefully working in some benevolent fashion on the patient's behalf. This is an enterprise of much more side-by-side accompaniment. That was Paul Farmer's word. So powerful, subjective, and a great equalizer, right? Okay. Suffering, by the way, I should pause too. We've all done suffering, but it's also strangely hard to define. This wheel just gives a sense that this is why palliative care has to be interdisciplinary. Really, healthcare has to be interdisciplinary. No one has a lock on what it means to suffer, no discipline, no one person. So that's why we invite so many other people into this mix, necessarily. But let me just quickly define suffering, so just as a level setting. So for me, I like to define it as a wedge. As a wedge that opens up in a person, in me. It's like a gap in me. I'm separated from myself on some level. There's a film in me, between me. And that gap, I think, has something to do with the delta, the difference between the world I have, the reality I inhabit, and the reality I wish for, And I think that gives us, it's an important definition because it gives us our two responses to it. One is, of course, just change your reality. Change the world, change reality. And I suppose we are all engaged in that enterprise, and thankfully so. This is activism, by the way. I wonder if that word registers with you. But again, given all the systems issues we're up against and all the taboos we have to somehow find a way to navigate, this work there's an activism to it. And we are actively trying to change the system and change the world and change the experience for everybody involved. There's some truth to that. I like to call it out because it also means at the end of the day how we can forgive ourselves for not somehow making it all better. This is a very hard enterprise. And part of the trick is just not running away. But the other way you can respond to suffering, of course, is to just quit wishing for things you don't have. I worked at a Buddhist hospice for years. And it was really beautiful to watch that in action. People who are trained and have the disposition and discipline to quit wishing for a reality that they couldn't have. And in that, they embodied acceptance and being okay with the world as it was. And that was a very powerful thing to be around. And either way, either approach, you can narrow the gap of suffering. Okay. One other thing to point out here, I've said as much already, is I sneak the word logistical on here. That's not necessarily acknowledged as a way we suffer, but I'd like it to be because, again, the system that we all that we work within also causes harm sometimes. It's very hard to deal with that fact, but it's true. And I just want to note that, just to be honest, but also to name sort of the mechanism of burnout. I mean, I think about myself when I'm up against the wall and my colleagues. It's very often, it's not because, necessarily because of the problems of illness. I'm not angry at cancer, I'm not angry at amputation, I'm not, but I am angry in the way we invent ways to make life harder than it has to be. So again, to call that out as a real force, I think that's probably the number one cause of burnout where I live anyway, is the system itself, not illness, not neediness. Okay, I think we've hammered that point enough. Now, these are just going to be provocations that I promised, guys. So that was just to level set a little bit and name the place where I'm coming from, and maybe it resonates with you. But these are just meant to get us thinking about what could be different. How might we change this enterprise? I'm really liking the word enterprise this morning. I don't think I've ever used that word. I don't know where it's coming from. Okay, so health. You have your health, you've got everything. I don't know if that phrase exists in Australia. It's in the States. Yeah, people say it all the time. You got your health, you have everything. Really? I know a lot of people who have just beautiful lipid panels and great blood pressure and don't meet criteria for depression and this or that, but who are in one way or another really lost and really miserable even, or misery-making, but healthy. So one thing is to sort of reorient ourselves. In the States, we often talk about quality of life as a second place finish. We'll say things like, I'm sorry, I can't cure your X, Y, or Z, but we can go for quality of life. It's like a second place finish. I think, I don't know. I'm interested in having my health, whatever the heck that is, so that I can have quality of life. I think part of this reorientation is to say that actually quality of life is actually the bigger prize. I think actually that's what we people in our hearts strive for more than perfect lipids. Perfect lipids are important. I'm sorry. they're good, they're important. But I think, again, on behalf of quality of life, that's the bigger prize. Okay, that's my point. Similarly, curing, really fantastic stuff. Wow, is it powerful. And it's just magical. And when we can do it, we should. And I'm in no way trying to turn down the dial on that effort. But I have to say, right, we know that not everything and everyone is curable. And never mind the demoralization of being approached as someone to be fixed. As a disabled person, this comes up a lot. People look at me as something to fix. I want to punch them in the nose. I am whole, I am fine by myself. I am okay with this. You don't need to pretend that this is some horrible, anomalous tragedy. This is a variation on a theme of how we suffer and how a body goes, right? So quit trying to fix me. This is a big source of consternation in my country between the disabled population and the healthcare system ostensibly sworn to serve it. But again, curing, powerful, lovely, let's do it when we can. But let's just not stop there. So if we're rewriting the system, well, healing, maybe that should be our goal. That healing is a more vague concept, but more importantly, it's much more in the person. Whereas curing is, again, you hold still while some expert cures at you. Healing is much more dynamic than that. Much more powerful, much more possible. So you guys have, I'm sure in your work, have met people who are dying and are whole, who are dismembered and whole, who are sick as can be and whole. By that, they are themselves. They are in their body. They are inhabiting their life, even as that body crumbles. So that, perhaps, I think, is the larger, better goal and something we should strive for. Okay? It's always possible, and our patients have so much more power in that math than they do in curing. Okay, this is all one, like, a lot of people come to my clinic, right, or show up in your ERs, and because something's gone wrong, right? And your job is to help them suffer less, help things be less hard, help life be less crappy. In a lot of ways, that's kind of the basic math of it, less horrible even. And that's okay. That's a good goal to ameliorate the pain. It's an important one. But I also just want us in this blue sky way to keep an eye out where we can be agents for life being more wonderful, not just less horrible. That is really, really important. For our own working in this, we need to feel that ourselves. I think it's a really powerful agent to push back on burnout. And again, I couldn't say enough. If you hear my comments as saying, oh, you guys should be doing more than you're doing, rethink that, or at least let's talk about it. That's not at all what I'm saying. I'm saying is we have things happening in front of us, whether we choose them or not, within us and without us, that if we just acknowledge them, have all this therapeutic potential that right now is going unrealized. So it's sort of an unearthing and unmasking what's already happening. I'm not asking you guys to do even more. But for our own sanity's sake, can't we keep an eye on where life could be even more wonderful, more beautiful? And it doesn't have to be much. It can be eye contact. It can be holding the door open for someone, kindness, sitting at the bedside with someone for an extra minute or two. It's not exotic, you know. All you have to do is, if you're working from this place of human being to human being, you already know so much. You have your own experience to tell you what makes you feel good. You can operate from there. Yeah, it's important for us to inhabit our patient's shoes, but we share patient's shoes. We are patients. So look within as much as without. This is a nod to the world beyond words. Words are great. I love them, really useful, but they're not everything. And so much of human communication is happening not at the level of words. It's happening in our body language, in our posture, our style, all sorts of other things happening all the time. So I just want to make a plug for the life beyond words. It's really important for two reasons. For us, I think, especially those of us engaged with medical education, you ever notice that how sometimes there's a kernel of something really good in a student, that somehow the training beats out of them? That somehow our training can send someone backwards in some level. And that's difficult. There is so much to learn, but one of the things that gets beat out of us, I think, is this idea of intuition. And it's very hard to foster it, but we all have it to some degree. And I want to make a plug for some of us to figure out a way how to honor it and work with it. Because it's not the stuff of data, but it is really, really powerful. And very often we as clinicians and our patients know something in their gut if we could just actually unearth it and talk about it and work from it. So this is a nod towards intuition. But from a patient point of view too, I like this example very much. Like the example is a hard way to put it. I see it a lot, and it's startling, which is oftentimes I'll run across folks who have dementia and are unable to tell me something. Like, sorry doctor, I do not want your feeding tube. Yet they're pulling their feeding tube out every chance they get. Is that not communication? All right? And I don't mean to oversimplify these things. I mean, case by case, there can be very, very important details in this mix. I'm just saying as an example of where someone's actually communicating with us, we say, oh, well, you can't put it into words, it doesn't exist. We have to, yes, advanced directives are important, but they're not the whole enchilada. Okay, you guys know who this is? Any nurses in the room, perhaps, in particular, might know. It's Florence Nightingale. So first of all, nod to nursing. Those of us who've been patients, I love my doctors, but I'm in love with my nurses, or I don't know, some extra order of magnitude. And the people I'm still in touch with from my 28 years ago experience are all nurses. So much of the experience of being a patient is at that interface. So just a thank you. But also to say, gosh, there's so much for us to learn from the discipline of nursing and from the history of nursing, because that's where the experience plays out. And I guess that's another way of looking at all these conversations. We're trying to call out the idea of living with illness and dying as an experience, not a transaction, not as an episode, not as a moment in time, but something that happens over time. And if we start looking at it as an experience, well, then we can start playing with it in a little different way, just like we do any other experience. Then all of a sudden the environment of care becomes important. And if you read her book, you'll find that a lot of comments in there are about things like the power of a window in a room, what that does for a patient, or fresh cut flowers. My favorite, she talks about the floor wax she likes to use on her ward because it has a certain feel, a certain smell, and it just conditioned the environment for a certain experience. And that was her job. And mind you, she wrote this, I think, in 1859, I don't remember, mid to late 19th century. So she's around at the same time where science and medicine is in, so she had other things to write about and to talk about. But this is what she chose in large part to uphold as part of her profession and part of her code. What she's really doing is pointing us to this word, my favorite word. And I guess I'm trying to make a plea that this belongs. So aesthetics, that word has gotten narrow. It now often just means pretty, pleasant. Aestheticians are working on our skin, and aesthetic dentistry might be straightening our teeth. And okay, I'm not demeaning that. I'm just saying that the word aesthetics is much larger than that. The word aesthetics only simply means the world of the senses, the felt universe. All right? So this is not an aside, this is front and center. When I think about what, for myself and what my patients want, yes, we want to be alive on some level, but I like this distinction. What we really are after, I think, is to feel alive. Not to be alive because we have a heart rate, but to actually feel this majesty of being alive while we are. And how do we feel alive? We feel it. It's the word. In our senses, we touch, we smell, we hear. This is an amazing plane that's accessible to us all the time, but you just can't make this stuff up. Where in healthcare, remember that ether dome moment? What was that? That was anesthesia, the antonym of aesthetics. In so many ways, when I'm a patient in the hospital, the highest goal for me has been just to get numb out. Like to feel nothing would be great. Just get me through this. Okay, but really I think what we have to kind of at least circle back to is the healing potential of just the world of our senses. Why am I happy to have a body? Why is it a neat thing to have a body? Because it feels things, period. When I was working through my own advanced directive, I was asking myself this question, like, when am I dead? When am I done? Like, what for me is the end? And all I could think of was when I could no longer feel anything, when I could no longer take anything in, when I was therefore cut off from the world around me. That's when I would feel dead, I think. That's a personal question, but I'm just telling you that that's how I arrived at my own line. Let's do this. Okay, so meaning, powerful force. We humans are we can inject meaning into anything. And depending on your beliefs, you might think that meaning exists, and our job is to somehow find it. We find meaning. We stumble upon it one way or another. Or you might say meaning doesn't exist and we make it, we create it. Picture as you like, but either way, we human beings, meaning is a very strong compulsion for us. And there's so much to work with in there. And it's powerful. And we clinicians, all of us, clinicians and administrators, we are involved in meaning-making stories with our patients all the time. You could shirk that. You could say, oh, well, my job isn't to make meaning, my job is to fix that elbow. Okay, fine. But you are, whether you like it or not, your patients are making meaning from everything you say. When you tilt your head, that moment you look away, whatever it is, how you greet them. Oh, did he smile? What's wrong? He's trying to tell me something. There's constant coding happening, and people are making meaning from everything we do. So you can choose to ignore that, but at your own peril. In fact, if you embrace it, there's just so much to work with. And part of that, so I want to make a plug for, so purpose is a big driving force. There's a source of meaning for us. Those of us, of course, we have our work, we have our family, we have some identifiable role that brings us a sense of purpose. And that is a very powerful force, and I love it, and I would never want to take it away. I just want to make a plug for purposelessness. Okay, and this is on the heels of the aesthetics comment. One of the things that's so cool about the life of the senses is that they're immediate. They don't require any time. So that makes them very powerful when time is running out. You don't need time to develop them. They're not a means to some end in a future state. The means and the ends collide. It's immediate. And you don't need any frontal lobe to process it. Again, back to folks living with dementia, which so many of us will be. When our intellect is no longer there to stream together a nice narrative, there's still value in a life because it can feel something. A body, a person can feel even beyond when they can think. So again, I think it's the bigger, higher, farther prize. And if really our enterprise is to help each other live until we die, we have to invoke the aesthetic. And we have to include a purposelessness. I say that because, okay, this is something for each of us to think about, but when in my daily life, what gets me through my day? What gives me just a feeling of being in my body and in my life? Well, for me, it's very often things like riding a bike. I love something about being on two wheels. And you could reduce that to say it's exercise, a means to an end. I would say, if you guys told me that riding a bike was worse than smoking, I would still do it. If the new data suggests biking is the most terrible thing in the world, I would still do it because I'm not doing it for my health. Similarly, playing with my dog is the other example for me in my own life. That is an aesthetic experience. Playing, you could say, oh, well, you're trying to exercise the dog. Well, sure, that's incidental, that's fine. My point is, in that moment, there's a majesty to that moment, and it just feels right, period, end of story. And it doesn't have to have a purpose, all right? So if you can find a way to grasp that with your patients, you'll be also carving out space for them beyond their purpose. Which kind of gets us to this slide. This is the placeholder for mystery. So how, medical education, I remember, the words "I don't know" were normally, when I said "I don't know," that would usually mean someone was telling me to get back to the library or study harder or work harder. It was a reveal of my ignorance. Who's the smartest person in this room? Someone's the smartest person. Whoever you are, I bet you would say that there's all sorts of things you don't know. I bet Einstein would admit part of his intelligence was probably admitting that he didn't know everything. All right? So we have to have some relationship to not knowing. We live, I don't know if it's what it's like here, but in the States we're in a very odd place. We pretend to know things we don't, and we pretend to not know things we do. It's a very strange dance we're doing. So I'm not, yes, knowledge, let's keep building it. Knowledge is a powerful, beautiful, wonderful thing. Let's build it as a body of knowledge. Yes, let's know what's knowable, but let's make space for what we don't know too. And if we're really serious about walking with patients and accompany them all the way to the end, we have to have some relationship with this mystery. You just have to. You can't pretend to know where that person's going or what's going on with them. But if you have a relationship with not knowing, that won't make you uncomfortable. That's an invitation for awe and wonder, which are beautiful forces. Not something that's very different from ignorance. Which gets me here. This is, when I think of our job, really, another way of putting all this is maybe our job has something to do with helping folks find perspective. I ended up studying art history after my injuries because I was realizing that there was a lot I couldn't change about what I was seeing. I couldn't change my limblessness. I couldn't change the world in so many ways. So where was my power? Where was my control? How do I apply myself in this world that didn't seem really made for me? Well, studying art it turned out to be a really good idea because what did it teach me? It taught me how to see things, how to look. We humans can change out our lenses. We can change our point of view. We can change the world by the way we look at it. That's a stunning force we humans have. So, and as folks engaged in health and wellness, it is perhaps the major force that we have. So for our own sake, we need to do this, but with our patients, we need to do this too. And so I love thinking about this. Like, what would it be like to be an astronaut, to be out in space, and to look back on the world as a single being, a single thing? Don't you imagine all the world's problems would end in some way? All the man-made problems would go away? If we could, I really want to study the minds of astronauts and see how they come back to Earth and how they live. That's sort of an aside. My point is you can see the world is filled with tons of differences, and we can see all the distinctions among us, and we humans are wired for that. Or you can pan out and see the world as a single unit. Or you don't have to stop there. You can see the world as a single unit among a gazillion other worlds and rocks in space. Or we can zoom in. These are virus particles. So we humans, this is stunning. This is telephoto lens we have, bless you, to move in and out, to change our context. That is so dang therapeutic. And it's a really amazing skill for all of us to hone and work with. All right, perspective making. However you go about doing it, please exercise that muscle. One way I know to do this is one of these moments where I wish my teachers had pulled me aside when I was a younger person and told me the difference. again, humans, I mentioned a second ago, we are really good at noting contrasts, symmetries, color, tone, all this. We notice distinctions. We notice where light and dark meet. Contrast. We're wired for it. It's amazing. It's great. It's okay. The problem we get into, we humans, is we do this extra thing that we don't have to do, which is that we judge these differences. So noting distinctions between us and among us is just a source of curiosity and wonder. But then so many of us, and I have to watch to myself too, somehow I'm will myself to go to this place of judgment. And not only noticing differences, but evaluating them. I just want to make a plea that we notice, that we really get disciplined around this distinction. For our patients, the feeling of being seen but not judged, what a powerful difference. If someone's seeing me and discerning me but not judging me, that is therapeutic to the highest degree. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. The second judgment creeps in, it's a very different feeling, a very different engagement. So I would just want to make a plug for this distinction. We have till 9, right guys? Okay, let me just do 1 or 2 more slides. And then let's get to, I just got to make a plug. So, sometimes our language is so screwy. Disabled, right, implies that you're less, or, somehow. Our language is always referencing some standard that's better than us. So we end up feeling less than all the time, like disability, illness, like it's like anomalous. In fact, it's of course entirely normal, But the other thing we do with that kind of thinking is we humans, the source of our creativity is very often our limitations. We as a species, we are pretty pathetic. Throw us out in the woods, like Asclepius, throw us out in the woods to fend for ourselves. We quickly reveal ourselves as not very robust critters. But we have this perspective-making possibility. We have this adaptive ability. We adapt better than any species around. That's what's allowed us to go farther and faster. So yes, disability, yes, there's loss in that. But also at some point, if we stick with it and with each other and with ourselves, we will, through our limitations, we will get to a very creative place. So we should honor that. We should love that. We should love that in ourselves and honor the source of that creativity. Okay, I want to say one thing about this too. So becoming, this is another key thing. I wish my teachers early on had said, whenever I learned the word independence, I wish they had said, put a little asterisk next to it and said, it doesn't exist. It's something you may strive for. It's a construct, a concept. But you guys tell me, have you ever known anyone ever to walk this earth who is totally independent, who needs nothing and needs no one? No, of course not. And by the way, of course, who would want to be that poor person? The truth is we are interdependent no matter how you slice it. And it may feel that this world we've constructed is for the independent people or able-bodied and blah, blah, blah. And then there's the world we have in nursing homes for the dependent folks. And there's this 2-tiered kind of life. The truth is, that's the made-up part. The truth is we are on this spectrum of independence. You can be relatively independent, relatively dependent, whatever else. But the reason to call that out is so that we don't accidentally send signals of shame when someone's gone to the realm of disabled or whatever it is. They haven't gone from independent to dependent. They've gone from dependent to a little more dependent. That's it. It's not nearly as far to fall. So for the experience on that you haven't lost everything. You've just lost a little compared to all there is, right? And there's so much unity in our shared dependence. That's something to relish, not castigate. Okay, okay. I'm sorry, there's just a lot to talk about. I really do want to get the questions, but I'll just simply say this is a painting, a Nicolas Poussin painting, 17th century, called Et in Arcadia Ego. You can't see it, but this guy's wandering happily around paradise, hiking in paradise, and they come across a tomb, a sarcophagus, and on the tomb it says Et in Arcadia Ego, which is Latin for I too dwell in paradise. It's not past tense. It's not like I was here. It's not a memorial. It says I am here. I too exist in paradise. Erwin Panofsky wrote a beautiful art historical essay on this. And their Et in Arcadia Ego is a title you'll see of many paintings throughout history. It's a theme. And his translation of this was, I too am in paradise. The I is death. The sarcophagus represents death. It's almost like a reminder, hey, death is in paradise too. And I don't know how you feel about that, but it's very interesting to think about. Like, perhaps death is absolutely critical for us appreciating the paradise we have. You start thinking about, how do you feel, how does anything register as precious? It's precious because you lose it. It can go away. That's what makes it precious. That's what makes it precious. So my point here is that perhaps death has something to do with our realizing the paradise we have. And perhaps our goal together is to appreciate the lives we have while we have them, not just after we've lost them, which is so often the norm. So my point there is not that we need to love death. That would be a little gruesome. But appreciating as part of the reality we inhabit, and therefore part of our purview and part of our work together, that is something I want us to register. And I'll end with this little last question. Who here, again, warning, cheap question coming, but just kind of fun to get in a ballpark. Who here, if you could push a button and live forever, who would push it? So it's a stunning kind of thing, because I think the rhetoric and everything, death is this horrible thing. We got to keep it at bay at all costs. And I don't know. You tell me. At some point, I know I don't want to live forever. So it's, again, maybe that helps us kind of rejigger and have a relationship with this death thing on behalf of ourselves as well as our patients. And it does something for us. At some point, if I think about my patients, very often they're ready to go by the time that death finally comes. That doesn't mean it's not sad. I'm not trying to orphan tears in this. But oftentimes it's harder for those of us who have to live on. So anyway, with that, I'll stop my comments and finally get to questions, or any comments or questions that you guys want to discuss.
I think Angela used the word healing, and I wondered what your perspective on that word was, because I think sometimes it's narrowly constrained us to fixing.
Yeah.
So I wanted to hear your thoughts on the word healing and how we represent this in a relationship.
Yeah. I love the word healing, and I love it because my patients have much more power in that enterprise than I can bestow upon them. In some ways, it eases my burden. When I can't fix someone, that can feel like a failure, right? And that's demoralizing for everybody. But if I can keep this idea of healing in mind, that's the thing that keeps me from not running away from them just because I couldn't fix them. That's the thing that helps me linger. That's the thing that helps me continue to relate to them. And just as importantly, perhaps, that's the thing that helps me learn from my patients. Watching them heal themselves, watching them get right with themselves before they go, it's an amazing thing to witness, and it's full of lessons for me, who's someone who's not quite dead yet, someone who's got to live on. So I am all for it. People mean different things by that word, and they can get kind of, especially where I live in San Francisco, it can get a little, whoo. But who am I to say, right? This is part of the deference we need to show each other. If you are healed by this or that enterprise, God, that word, I don't know. If you are healed, I'm sorry. If you are healed by this or that thingy, then who am I to say no to that's right or wrong? The people, we demonstrate our wholeness to each other one way or another, and that we should understand what goes into that, and that's a lot more than just medication.
What's your opinion when someone is ready to go, but maybe before everyone else thinks they're ready to go? So in terms of them making the decision to go.
Such an important point. And you watch the theater that comes up, families and everyone protecting each other. Oh, don't tell mom she's dying. And then you talk to mom, she's like, when are this kid's going to be able to talk about the fact that I'm dying? Or whatever it is. We're constantly protecting ourselves from this truth, which I guess is so much of what I'm trying to do, and I think what a lot of us are trying to do is keep pushing back on the reductive walls of what constitutes real or good, and really open this thing up. It's much more interesting and much bigger than we experience in a daily way, or it can be. And part of that realization that each of us also are filled with mixed emotions too, and to be able to talk safely and openly about that is really, really key. So Angela and I were talking about earlier, denial Denial is a funny thing. It is a real thing. It's a powerful thing. It's a very useful thing. But I also think it's overplayed. I think part of what we're experiencing, perhaps why you came to work early to have this conversation, is, what's been hard is to find a safe place and the right language with which to talk about this big, in some way, beautiful subject. So I think so much if we make space, some of our job really is to make space and offer language, clunky as it is, to wade into this subject. So we're not constantly doing weird things to each other to pretend one thing or another on behalf of another and protect each other from things that they don't need protecting from. So let me back into your question. So very often we'll see patients who are ready to go, but family are not ready to let them go. And sometimes that's a beautiful thing. A lot of those patients will wink at me and they'll say, well, I love my family, whatever they need, I'll hang around for until they get there, whatever. We'll scratch that itch together. And sometimes that's just fine, and it's the one final gift from the dying person to their family. And that's beautiful, and that's okay. Where I think I try to blow past it is where it's causing distress, where that poor patient is being propped up in ways that they don't want to be, that are actively hurting them, and it's not really registering as something beautiful for the family. There's no gift in it. It's just really propelling, compounding pain. So whatever sort of vibe I run into in dynamic between patients and family, my first question, of course, or any palliative physicians or clinicians' first question is it serving them? It's not a question of is it right or wrong or accurate, but is it actually serving them? And if it is, then I don't muck with it. But very often, if it's not serving, then I might try to blow through that and try to say, hey, family, I think what your mom is telling us is X, Y, and Z, that they're ready to go. And I think what you need to do is dig down and let your mom go, because she's going to go either way. And if you can find some way to be with her to the end, that would be a beautiful thing. Or whatever. I'm just making language up right now. But I guess to call out what you're describing happens all the time. And I guess my takeaway is it serving them?
How can we work with each other when we're actually working with people who are the unhealed wounderer? And that's not recognized. We're not recognizing that in ourselves, and that's the bit where we bump into.
It's a really important question, and I would imagine that most of us on some level are guilty of that, of our unconscious biases and the way our convictions, in some ways we love convictions, especially as clinicians. Our patients want to see convictions. There's a confidence that comes from that, etc. But this posturing can often cause harm and can get in the way of honest self-reflection. And I guess one answer to your question is that somehow in medical education and in the workforce and the ethos of a place and a system, we have to bake in self-reflection. That is our homework. Because otherwise you're going to be an agent, you're going to be causing suffering. And I'm pretty sure that's not what any of us wants to do. So I would simply say, let's drive self-reflection deeper into our curricula. And if you're an attending, for example, and working with students, I love the moments, this may sound silly, I look for moments to apologize for or to reveal my own insecurities as a teaching tool for my students, for them to say, oh, he's insecure too. Oh, then I'm not going to feel so bad, and I'm not going to cover up all my insecurities anymore. Maybe I'll share them, get them out on the table. Maybe they'll become less insecure. So we can model this with each other. Part of it is just simply owning our own suffering. And this idea of bias, it's not, we should do away with bias. Good luck. I would say that's really not a good use of time. It's better, how do we work with our biases?
So please join me